Okay, so Unit 7. Unit 7 is about the legal system. So the two basic things with the legal system is understanding the difference between civil and criminal law. Civil law is involving disputes between two or more parties, and it involves usually money. It involves property, something of value, and it is a situation where you're suing someone because excuse me, you're suing someone because you lost the property, you had loss of money, a contract dispute, a divorce proceeding, child custody, things of that nature. So it's something of some sort of intrinsic value or monetary value. So what happens in a civil case? In a civil case, someone's going to sue someone else. And what's going to happen is you're going to see a plaintiff, that's the person who brings forth the lawsuit, file a complaint. You hire a lawyer, you send the complaint to the civil courtroom, a judge will look at it, and then a summons will be sent to the defendant, the person accused of the wrongdoing. Someone who maybe stole the property and refused to return it, or maybe someone who has custody of a child and doesn't want to give up custody of the child, or the fact that a contract was broken. They're accused of the wrongdoing, the person who did something that upset the plaintiff. It's up to then the defendant to basically file a written response, and the written response is sent back to the courtroom. The then written response is sent to the plaintiff's lawyer, and then we move on to the discovery phase. And this is when both lawyers, both sides, get together, lay out all their evidence. They'll interview witnesses. This is called deposition. And it's during this time that sometimes you'll settle out of court. In other words, you don't want to have to pay all the lawyer fees, the expense of going to the courtroom, and you'll just settle out of court. If you don't settle out of court, you then go to an actual trial proceeding. There'll be a judge, there'll be a jury, and you will basically present your arguments. So the plaintiff will present their arguments, the defendant will present their arguments, and it's up to the jury to make the final decision of who wins the case. Because the burden of proof is called preponderance of the evidence. In other words, who has the best case, who has the best argument. And there is an appellate court for civil cases. So if you're the plaintiff and you don't win the case, you can file an appeal. So there's a process that you could appeal the ruling of the judge and jury. So there are two types of damages that are awarded if the plaintiff wins the case. You have compensatory damages, which is the actual damages. So if you were in a car accident and your car was damaged, you had medical expenses, you had loss of work earnings, that's actual damages, compensatory. Then there's something called punitive damages. Punitive damages are the pain and suffering. That's where we a lot of times see the bigger awards of money. We see larger amounts of money sent to the person who won the case. So with the civil case, that's basically all you need to know. With a criminal case, now certainly we went into a lot of detail in class about what happens in a criminal case. More detail than what you really need to know. But the basics that you need to know about a criminal case is obviously a crime has to be committed. We're talking about felonies or misdemeanor charges. And we'll look at that and we'll talk about that in just a second here. But in a criminal case, what happens is there'll be a situation where a person is accused of a crime. They'll be arrested. They'll be booked. They'll have their mug shot, their fingerprints taken. Then they'll go to a bail hearing. And bail is an opportunity to avoid going to jail during the course of your trial. It's a way for you to be released early. That way you're out, still working at your job or still out in public and not having to sit in a jail cell waiting your trial. And once you actually get past the bail hearing, we have what is called an arraignment. An arraignment is where you enter a plea, guilty or not guilty. You can use the insanity plea, but it's not one that is very successful in a courtroom. You then move from the arraignment to the actual trial. If it is a serious crime, such as a first-degree murder charge, you could see a grand jury hearing. The grand jury is a jury made up of about 18 to 25 people, and they listen to the facts of the case, and they decide whether or not there's enough evidence to go to trial. Now, if the grand jury says no, the prosecutor, the one who is trying to get the defendant found guilty of the crimes, will have a chance to represent in front of a grand jury. If they, once again, do not get a indictment, which is the word that's used that the grand jury hands down, then if there's no indictment, there's no trial. So we then move on, that person will be freed from the charges. If the grand jury does hand down an indictment, we go to trial. And we have an opening statement. We have an actual presentation of the plaintiff's case, the prosecutor, the state in this circumstance, or the federal government. And then the defense attorneys can cross-examine their witnesses, the prosecutor's witnesses. The defense side goes second to present their argument. They don't have to really present anything because you are proved or presumed innocent until proven guilty, and it must be beyond reasonable doubt. That is the burden of proof in a criminal case. So the defense side will present evidence, though, but they don't have to. The defendant, the person accused of the crime, does not even have to testify because in that circumstance you have the right to Fifth Amendment, no self-incrimination. So once the defense presents their arguments, we have closing statements from both sides, and it's up to the jury to make the decision. If there's not a jury trial, it's called a bench trial. We usually see these in misdemeanor cases, traffic violations. The judge listens to the arguments and they hand down the verdict. But if it's going to be a felony charge, there will be a jury. At any point during this process, you can go into a plea bargaining agreement. This means that the plaintiff, the prosecutor, the government, and the defendant, the suspect, the person accused of the crime, will come into a compromise, and it's a way to reduce the punishment for the defendant. And of course, the defendant will have to admit that they committed the crime. They have to admit guilt. So in a criminal case, very similar to a civil case, except for the difference of the burden of proof. Now, in sentencing, a judge will hand down the sentence, except for the rare case of a first-degree murder conviction in North Carolina. The jury actually has to make the decision of whether the person gets life imprisonment or the death penalty. So with sentencing options, as far as what the judge can do, there's two types of sentencing options. There's indeterminate, which means that the judge can say you can get anywhere between 5 to 15 years in prison, and the judge makes the decision. Mandatory sentencing we see in federal cases, where if you are convicted of a certain crime, the punishment's already set and the judge has no discretion to change it. You could get probation. You could get sent to a circumstance where you are sent to boot camp if you're a juvenile offender. There's other options of suspended sentences, home confinement, which is more or less house arrest, a monetary fine. You could be on work release. You could have to pay restitution for damages. You could be sentenced to a certain amount of time in jail or prison, or you could receive the death penalty. Not all states have the death penalty. North Carolina does have the death penalty. We currently are not executing prisoners because of a state case. So, with Unit 7, looking at sentencing options, there's really just a variety of options for the judge to hand down certain punishments. Now, some basic rights that you have as someone who's accused of a crime. Remember your Fifth Amendment rights. You have a right to no self-incrimination, no double jeopardy, Sixth Amendment right to a speedy trial. You also have a right to an attorney and the right to hear and question all witnesses. The Eighth Amendment basically says that there are no excessive bills or fines or cruel or unusual punishment, which brings in the death penalty argument. So, in Unit 7, there's a brief mentioning of the internet and the law. This comes into school filters. You're not supposed to be looking at inappropriate content while you're at school, or playing video games, unless it's something that is educational based. So schools have a right to restrict your access to the internet. This also ties into terrorism. People who are hacking into government programs. There are laws in place that prohibit this, and you can prosecute people for those actions. If you are threatening someone online, if you're bullying someone online, there's laws that deal with that specifically. We do know that we want to protect children with the internet, so there's specific laws that protect children when they're on the internet, that companies cannot request specific information about that child. So with the internet and the law, just understand that there are restrictions. You don't have fundamentally access with First Amendment rights to anything and everything with the internet. Certain institutions can restrict what you do on the internet. The last thing that's in Unit 7 is really talking about juveniles. And the term juvenile, this means someone who's under the age of 18. Once you turn 18, you're an adult. You can vote. Obviously, you graduate from high school, you go get a job, and you live your life. But we do know that some people who are under the age of 18 make mistakes and break the law. Those individuals are called juvenile delinquents. Now, when it comes to juveniles, you have the same rights as adults. And the one key aspect of juvenile cases is that we want to make sure that we protect your privacy so that we can rehabilitate you. We can fix you so you don't become an adult offender later in life. You have rights as far as a right to a trial. No jury, though. It's going to be a bench trial with a judge. You have a right to Fifth Amendment rights, no self-incrimination, a right to an attorney. You have a right to hear and question all witnesses. So even as a juvenile, you have basically the same rights as an adult would have in a criminal case. But the biggest difference between adult trials versus juvenile trials is we want to protect the identity of the juvenile and give them a chance at a second opportunity of life. In other words, fix the juvenile so they don't become an adult offender later in life. There's a very important case called Henry Galt. Henry Galt is a case that established the rights of juveniles, and this was a case back in the 1960s. We also have the case of New Jersey versus TLO, and this basically said in school your rights are restricted. We can search you. Now teachers can't search you, administrators can, and SROs can because they're law enforcement officials. We also have the case of Hazelwood versus Colemeyer, and this is a restriction of publications in school. So the administration can restrict First Amendment rights, freedom of the press, and freedom of speech when it comes to school publications. This would be like a school newspaper or a school website that students create, or the yearbook. That administrators can restrict what goes in those publications, because remember that when we talk about individual rights, whether you're an adult or a juvenile, we have to balance the rights of the individual versus the safety and rights of the community. In essence, you're going to lose. The community's interest in safety and rights are going to always take precedent over individual rights and individual liberties. So in Unit 7, it's really just understanding that the different types of law, primarily civil and criminal. We do have other types of law as well, international law, administrative law, we have statutory law. But the biggest thing about Unit 7 is understanding the difference between criminal and civil. Certainly make sure you understand the difference between a felony and misdemeanor. A felony is a serious charge. So we're talking about a circumstance of murder, rape, arson, manslaughter, versus a misdemeanor, which is a less serious charge. So we're talking about, maybe vandalism, petty theft. Certainly understand that there are two types of crimes: crimes against the person and crimes against property. Crimes against the person typically are violent crimes. These are crimes, once again, murder, rape, manslaughter. But then we see crimes against property, and we're talking about theft, vandalism, arson. because you're harming property versus harming a person. And also know the difference between jail and prison. Jail is if your sentence is a year or less, you go to jail, which is maintained by county government. Then if you have a sentence that is more than a year and it's a state offense, you go to state prison. If it's a federal offense, you go to federal prison. And understand that laws are there to protect us. Provides order. It sets punishment. It is supposed to be fair. It's supposed to be uniform for all people. And laws must be understandable. They must be reasonable. And they're there just to promote community safety and promote just certain moral guidelines. The very first written set of laws, Code of Hammurabi, 282 written laws with specific punishments based on your social status. Whereas laws today, we don't really take into account social status. We're not supposed to, at least. The reality is sometimes colored skin, religious beliefs, sexual orientation, and gender do play a role in how you are perceived in the courtroom and sometimes how you're actually punished if found guilty. The reality, we cannot legislate the human heart. It is something that is beyond the control of, politics and government and society. It's something we really just cannot control. So, with Unit 7, understand the basics of the legal system, the basics of law, and you'll be pretty good with that. Now, next up, we're going to be looking at the last 3 units, Unit 8, 9, and 10, which are talking about economics, and I'm also going to share an additional video with you to share some test-taking tips. So until then, see you later.